This is Research Like a Pro, episode 51, Which DNA Test Should I Take? Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Nicole Dyer, co-host of the Research Like a Pro genealogy podcast. I'm here with accredited genealogist, my mom, Diana Elder. Hi, Diana. What's new with you?
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today, and we're talking about DNA, which is going to be super fun, and I'm right in the middle of a big DNA project, so this is perfect timing.
Great. Yes, we're excited to welcome Robin Wirthlin to the podcast today. Robin has been blogging with us at Family Locket as our genetic genealogy specialist. Hi, Robin. How are you?
I'm doing so well. I'm so excited to be here with you on the podcast today.
Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about how to know which DNA test you should take and DNA testing strategies. Before we jump into that, let's do our listener spotlight. This is a review from Sandy Kraus. She says, I love the way they break down the process into manageable pieces. They also explain everything in a way that is easy to follow. I have completed the BU, Boston University, certification, and their methods follow what I learned from that program as well. I highly recommend listening to this podcast. Thank you, Sandy. That was so nice. It was great to hear from you.
All right. Well, let's jump into our content of the day. And first, I wanted to do a little bit of intro about Robin. So, Robin, I know that we met for the first time at SLIG in January of this year of 2019. And SLIG, if our listeners don't know, is the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy. And I was there doing a class on advanced Southern methodology with Mark Lowe. And Robin, what class were you doing?
I took DNA for the 21st Century Professional with Angie Bush.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing. I did advanced DNA last year, so I wanted to do something different this year, but I probably should have taken that with you because it would have been great. Can you tell us just a little bit about your background? Why are you really interested in DNA? What's your motivator there?
Well, I've always been interested in family history and had an interest in my ancestors and the stories, and that's always motivated me to make good choices and appreciate the sacrifices that they've made for me so that I could have a better life. And one of those opportunities that I had was going to college, and I originally wanted to go to medical school. I majored in molecular biology and nutrition. I started working in a laboratory at BYU, and we worked on mitochondrial DNA, and I worked there for 3 years. And then I worked at Myriad Genetics for 2 years until I had my own children. And then we jokingly say that those are my own genetic experiments. It was really thrilling to see the merging of DNA research and genealogy, two of my great loves and passions. And it's been exciting to learn and to help other people to learn more about their DNA and how they can use it.
Well, I was so excited when you came up and introduced yourself to me because you had been following us on Family Locket, I believe, and you knew who I was, and I didn't know you, but it was so fun to meet you and talk to you throughout that week of SLIG. And when I learned that Robin had this background in DNA and genetic genealogy, I just jumped on the chance to have her join us at Family Locket and start writing blog posts for us. And now we're excited to have her start doing podcasts with us because, of course, Family Locket needed their own genetic genealogy specialist. So we're pretty excited to be working with Robin. Let's just jump into our topic for today. Today we're doing the basics because for those of us who've been doing DNA with genealogy for a while, we know about the different tests and the testing companies, and we may feel like everybody knows this, right? But I get so many comments and questions from people that don't have a clue. They are just new to this and they have no idea what kind of tests they should be taking. Even if you feel like you already know all this stuff, I always find that I learn more. There's always more to learn, more to solidify. So hopefully we're going to do a lot of that today. So Robin, just give us a little bit of information about what is DNA.
DNA is a short form of deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the genetic code that's carried in each of the cells of our bodies.
I am not even going to try to say that after you because I would sound foolish. I am so glad that we've shortened that to DNA. So my first experience with DNA was back in the early 2000s. I believe it was 2004, 2005, and it was through Sorensen Labs. And they were doing Y-DNA testing, and we used that to prove, my connection to the Roysons in Virginia. So Robin, tell us just a little bit about when you started using DNA.
So I started using DNA for genealogy in 2014. I had been friends with Angie Bush at BYU, and we worked at Myriad Genetics together. And I saw her on a listing that she was teaching a class. And so I looked her up and wrote to her, and she said, "Jump on in, Robin." So I started testing myself and then my family, then trying to figure out, how does this all work? What can I learn from it? And how can I help other people to learn? My highest match that I had was a cousin who was adopted. So it was such an amazing mystery. So I jumped in and we worked on this, and it was like a detective work. Her husband had been a former detective for the LA Police Department, and he said, "I can't believe this detective work that you have to do." But it was great, and we solved that mystery, and I learned so much along the way.
I love that you said that because I feel like DNA is especially something that we have to jump in and try. You can read all the books, watch all the webinars, listen to all the podcasts, but until you get in there and kind of get your feet wet, you don't solidify what you're doing until you actually do a project and you really practice it. And I still find that with what I'm doing.
I agree. You are more interested in it when it's your family or when you have a goal or a mystery that you're trying to figure out. It is a motivator to get you back to looking at things and examining them from different angles. And I do think you need some base knowledge to start out, but as you're starting, you can learn along the way. You don't have to be an expert to start. You can start with a little bit of knowledge. And I think that these podcasts are going to be a great foundation for people to learn more and be able to utilize their DNA results in their research.
I agree. We found that a lot of people are really auditory learners. They like to learn by listening. And, we know we all have different learning styles. And for me, I have to hear it and then see it and then do it. I have to work with all three. And so we're really hoping that all of you listening will be able to listen to these podcasts and then go and try it and then let us know what other things you need help with so we can cover that. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about the history of how it all kind of came together for genealogy?
I worked on mitochondrial DNA back in the 90s in relation to diseases. So it was thought that because mitochondrial DNA is inherited from your mother's line, and it can be unique, that you could use it in genealogical purposes for that. Or the Y DNA went just back on the father's line. So those were revolutionary tests and very exciting. And then, the question was, well, what about all of the other 22 chromosomes? When can we look at those? And I often heard that's not really practical to be used on a wide level in genealogy. But now DNA testing is becoming more and more affordable and more popular and more well known. It started out with these DNA direct to consumer tests. It first became available in 2009 from 23andMe. 2010 was Family Tree DNA, and 2012 was Ancestry DNA. According to the MIT Technology Review, by the beginning of 2019, more than 26 million people have taken a commercial DNA test. And genealogists are increasingly using shared and inherited DNA as another piece of evidence in determining and discerning family relationships.
Oh, yeah. And I think that we all are seeing this huge increase of matches on our lists, which, to be honest, can be a little bit overwhelming or a lot overwhelming. And I think a lot of us take the test and then see all those matches and then just say, okay, I can't deal with it. It's too much. But we are really committed to trying to figure out a process for helping people to use their DNA. So that's why we're pretty excited to all be working together, Nicole and Robin and I, to come up with a process that's doable. And part of that is what we're talking about today, just learning about what tests we should take and what we can do with it.
So wonderful. I've been loving using DNA evidence, and it's kind of surprising to hear that Ancestry DNA didn't start their testing until 2012. That just seems so recent, but they have such a huge pool of test takers now. It's amazing. All right, let's talk about what genealogists can do with DNA. So, really, what are most genealogists looking for, Robin, when they're using DNA evidence?
That's a great question. As genealogists, we really want to verify relationships. We want to make sure that we're connecting the right people to the right families and making sure that we have that unique identity of an individual identified and connecting them with their parents and so on. So we use records of all types, right? We use census, tax records, church records, war records, all kinds of records. But now the exciting thing is that we have access to a new type of record, which is a biological one, and that is in the form of DNA.
It's just incredible that we can use that. And there's so many more options available now for finding these kind of records because they're in the form of living people. We just need to track down cousins to test.
You're totally right. And that is part of the step in the process, is finding certain people that will help us to prove a hypothesis or disprove one.
It's just amazing how when you have a burned county, you have to go and find records that were kept at like a state level or a federal level. Now we have this other option to find records that exist on a biological level.
I think it's miraculous. It is really remarkable that we have this. And I think as more and more people are looking to their heritage and trying to figure out, where did I come from, and what can I learn from my ancestors, or what country did I come from, using DNA is a way to be able to overcome some of the hurdles or the difficulties in research, such as record loss.
Right. Yeah, those brick walls that we've all had that we're hoping we can overcome somehow. Okay, you mentioned earlier that autosomal DNA was not really thought to be able to be used for genealogy at first, but then we started using it. So let's talk more about autosomal and really what autosomes are and how it all works. What are these chromosomes and everything like that?
Autosomal DNA is talking especially about the 22 chromosomes that are not your X chromosome or the Y chromosome. And they're numbered 1 to 22, and you can see them laid out with some in karyotypes. If you're looking at that, maybe you've seen it in a biology class or something that you're learning. So the process that by which the autosomal DNA is tested is they use a microarray chip, and they check about 600 to 700,000 locations in your DNA, and they're looking for single nucleotide polymorphisms, which just means it's a substitution of a single nucleotide at a specific position in the genome. And the ones that are tested are present in some degree in specific populations. And because they vary from population to population, they can be used genealogically. Let's say you take an autosomal DNA test, those are the ones that are advertised on TV, and you take the test and use saliva and you spit into a tube. And the best way to ensure that your saliva is going to work is to kind of chew on your cheeks a little bit and get some extra cells to go into that saliva. Makes it work a lot better. I know some people have had failed tests and had to repeat them. And if you're working with an elderly family member, that can be a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And then other tests use a cheek swab, and then where you scrape the inside of your cheek with a little swab, and then you put it into the tube and break off the stem and send that into the testing company.
What happens when the DNA test results are submitted to the testing company?
The laboratories at the testing company extract DNA from the sample, and then they run it on that microarray chip, and they get information in the form of letters that symbolize the 4 different nucleotides that comprise DNA. Then they compare that information to other people that are in their database, and they see what amounts of DNA you share with the other people in their database. And then they'll give you a printout or a list online of the people that you share DNA with and the amounts. And those amounts are listed in centimorgans or percentages. Some people find percentages a lot easier to comprehend because we work with percentages often in the course of our regular life. And centimorgans is technically it's a measurement of the likelihood of your DNA to recombine. But a simple way to look at it is if you share more centimorgans with a person, then you are more closely related to them.
That is helpful. And I've often wondered about the centimorgans and how that really works, but it sounds like it's just a little bit more advanced. So I need to do some biology studying. So another thing to note is that when you're abbreviating centimorgans, it's a lowercase c and an uppercase m so that it's not confused with centimeters.
That's a great point.
I explained that to a client last week when I was meeting with him, and the project I had done was to find the relationship between him and one of his DNA matches, and he just had no idea what centimorgans was. It's funny how we get going talking and we just assume people will understand. And he's like, "What is a centimorgan?"
Well, one thing that I love about the Research Like a Pro podcast is how you talk about how you don't have to know everything at first, and everybody starts new at some point. As we learn these different things, and sometimes we kind of look back and say, wow, I didn't even know this, but that's okay because you've learned it now.
So true. I've often heard that you need to hear something 3 times before it really sinks in. And I think that's how it has been for me with learning about DNA. I've been listening to a lot of lectures over the years, and now that I'm using it more and more, a lot of things have really started to make sense after hearing it so many times.
I agree with you. It's like building a layered cake. You get a layer and then you learn some more and you add another layer and then you add another layer. And sometimes it takes a while for some of the concepts to really click. And when they do, it's exciting because then you can utilize your DNA results even more effectively.
Yes. Okay, so you receive your DNA match list from the company, and you have a list of cousin matches and a list of how much DNA that you share with them. Now, what do you do with that? Do you instantly know how you're related to them because of the percentage of DNA that you share?
Great question. Well, there are charts and the Shared Centimorgan project has been done to see what are the ranges of the amounts of DNA that people share in known relationships. I can see, like in my own family, that one cousin that I share with him almost on a first cousin level, but really I'm a first cousin once removed. So I just happen to inherit a lot of the same DNA that he did. So there are some calculators out there, especially on DNA Painter. The Blaine Bettinger's Shared Centimorgan project is on there, and it's a collaboration between Leah Larkin, the DNA geek, and Johnny Pearl, who created the website, and Blaine Bettinger. And you can enter the amount of centimorgans, or the percentage of DNA that you share with someone, and then it will calculate out the possible relationships that you may share with that person.
That is such a helpful tool. And I think people who haven't done this before might be surprised with how many possible relationships there could be once you get down below immediate family members. And it includes half and once removed, twice removed, all the different combinations of different kinds of cousins that you could have.
That's right. And as you look at your match list, there are some predictions on some of the websites of the testing companies that they predict a certain relationship. It might be that relationship, but you have to keep an open mind because perhaps it is a different relationship because you just happen to share an abnormally large amount of DNA with that person. But the great thing is that it gives you a wide possibility. So when I start making charts of the people and my cousins and how much I share with them, then I'm able to calculate out the likelihood of them being in a certain relationship. And I put that amount of DNA shared in the chart so that then it's a more of a visual of what you've got. And one general rule of thumb is that you can cut the amount of DNA in half as you go down a generation and down another generation. So each parent gives their child 50% of his or her DNA. And that 50% from each parent is comprised of an average of 25% from each grandparent. And then that's an average of 12.5% from each great grandparent. But you may get a little more or you may get a little less from each of those grandparents.
That's a really good point to remember that it's just an average and it's not exact because of the random nature of that recombination. It's so helpful. So, when you have these estimated relationships, then what do you have to do next to figure out the relationship?
You really need to look at it in a family tree or in a chart because DNA, it really only means something genealogically when it's compared with familial relationships and family history records. So you want to look at that DNA and see the people in a family tree and say, does this make sense? And like with my one cousin, where we shared 700 centimorgans, does that make sense that he's a first cousin once removed? Well, not really. Would make more sense if we were first cousins. But when I compared him to my siblings, they shared the right amount of DNA to be a first cousin once removed. You've got to use more than one data point to make sure that you have the correct relationship.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So, when should you take an autosomal DNA test?
You should take an autosomal DNA test if you want to learn more about your family and your ancestors or your ethnicity. Now, ethnicity is a science that's in its infancy and it changes over time. I know I have different ethnicity results at each testing company where my DNA is, but it is interesting and it could help guide you to some answers about your family. And it's certainly great party conversation. And the other thing is that you can count on it being accurate to the continental level, but maybe not down to the country level.
That's a really good rule of thumb because then it will keep us from getting all upset that our DNA results are so different.
Right? Like how I have no Danish ancestors, but I know they came from Denmark.
Right. Well, that was a great overview of autosomal DNA. Thank you.
So I have to jump in here and just tell a funny story that I was reminded of as you guys were talking about testing elderly relatives. We were doing a trip up to Washington a couple years ago, and I decided to stop in Idaho and see my mother, who was 90, and get her DNA. We were meeting at a Mexican restaurant, and I said, now, Mom, you can't eat or drink 30 minutes before the test. So don't eat or drink anything, and we'll do the test right when we get there, and then we can have our meal. So we get to the restaurant, and they bring out the chips and the salsa and everything. And I said, well, I need to run and use the restroom really quick because I'd been on the road for a few hours. And when I come back, she's eating a chip. And I hadn't done the DNA test yet. And I said, why are you eating a chip? And she said, oh, I forgot. So we went ahead, did the DNA test, and everybody joked that it was going to come back, that we'd have some weird results. And it was totally fine. So I was so grateful for that. But yeah, it's a trick when you are working with people, getting that spit the correct way.
That's a great point, Diana. You have to work within the situation that you have. So I usually tell people to really rinse out their mouth really well and then do the test.
Yeah, well, I don't even know if I did that, but I was just grateful when it came back and it worked. So DNA is fun. You have all sorts of adventures with it. One of the questions that I get asked a lot, Robin, is what is the best company to test with? What is a testing strategy? And we have all these options, and of course, they all cost money. So people want to, use their money to the best way possible. And, what is a good strategy? What do you do?
I think a great general rule of thumb is to test at Ancestry. Their database is the largest. They have over 14 million people in it. And you are likely to have some relatives who will share DNA with you that are in that database. But Ancestry has some limitations that it has fantastic trees, but you can't see any information down on a more broken down level. A lot of people then transfer their DNA from Ancestry over to gedmatch.com, where they can use some of the tools and to utilize their results and analyze their results more fully. Another company to test with is 23andMe, and they have over 9 million people in their database, and it's growing. A lot of people test with 23andMe because they're interested in their health traits, and that is fascinating to see what kind of different health traits that you have. So the limitations with Ancestry and 23andMe is they don't allow DNA result transfers from any other company. So you have to really test directly with either of those. But then you can take the results from Ancestry or 23andMe and transfer those results or the raw data. You download it to your computer and then you upload it to another company, such as Family Tree DNA or MyHeritage or LivingDNA. And that makes those databases larger. And you may have a relative who has only tested at a certain company because they had a sale, or in some cases of some of my relatives, they passed on after the test was done. And, I never had a chance to test them at Ancestry. It was just Family Tree DNA. So basically, take an Ancestry or 23andMe test, and definitely take an Ancestry test if you're using it for genealogy. Transfer those results to Family Tree DNA, and for $19, you can unlock the tools that Family Tree DNA has and transfer that same raw data over to MyHeritage. And for $29, you can unlock the tools and utilize their website, and transfer to LivingDNA, which has a new DNA-driven matching system and family tree reconstruction method that's based on the user's DNA, their gender, and their age. It's exciting. And LivingDNA is a great company to test with if you have British Isles ancestors, because it's based there and it can really break down which county people came from. It's remarkable.
Wow, so many great options. I know that I originally tested with Ancestry and then learned about the transfer. And when I was working with my sister, who's an adoptee, I had her tested Ancestry, and then she tested at 23andMe, and her actual closest connection was on 23andMe. And that became, a huge boon to the research. So if you are an adoptee, I would guess that you would recommend definitely being on all the websites.
Yes, it's often referred to as fishing in all the ponds. So you want to have your DNA in every company. Some people they're only interested in testing with one company, or they don't have the finances to buy DNA tests at every company, or the knowledge that they can transfer information. So as you are searching, definitely make sure your DNA is in every database possible.
The whole idea of transferring might seem kind of tricky to people, but I found it really, really easy. And each company is a little different, right? You have to go into your settings or your account profile, but then it's a simple click, download, and it comes in as a nice, neat file that you use to upload.
Each company has instructions on their website about how to download your raw data. And then if you can upload it to another company, then the other company will have instructions on how to upload it. So we could look up some of those articles that they have on the websites and put those in the show notes.
Great. We can just have a link to each company, because I know sometimes you get on a website and you don't know exactly where to click or what to find. So if you have a link that sends you directly to the information, that can be very helpful. So we'll definitely put that in the show notes, a link to those companies for how to do that. All right. So exciting that we have autosomal and DNA now. I know that I am using it for my project, and I am trying to use it to connect an ancestor who was born in 1828. And I know I'm kind of stretching because you can only go back, I believe, is it 7 generations? And she is 5 for me. How far back can we go with autosomal?
You can go back about 6, 7, or 8 generations, and it depends on how much DNA was passed from that ancestor on down. You have a 100% likelihood of sharing DNA with your siblings or your first cousins or your second cousins. But after that, you may or may not share DNA with a third, fourth, fifth, or sixth cousin. And so that's the limitation, because that DNA, you can estimate that it will be cut in half with each generation that it goes down. So the farther away you are from a target ancestor, the less DNA you're going to share with that ancestor, and the less DNA that your cousins are going to share with them. But if you can find cousins that share with that ancestor, you can build a case that you have indeed identified the correct ancestor and that genealogical line is proven.
Well, here's a fun example of that in this project I'm doing right now. I used Ancestry's through lines to find some suggestions of cousins that all come from my Benjamin Cox, my hypothesized ancestor. And I found a cousin match and emailed her, and it was wonderful because she messaged me right back, which those of you who have worked with messaging cousins on Ancestry, sometimes that doesn't happen. So I was really feeling really lucky. And we immediately compared our match on GEDmatch and found the exact chromosome, which was on her paternal line and on my paternal line. And so it's looking like a good match. So we have been comparing our matches, and she has a whole different set of matches for this Cox line than I do, save one other gentleman who looks like we are a common match. So it is so interesting that this DNA comes down and we all get different pieces of it. And as cousins, we each have our own little piece, and we're going to match with maybe one cousin, but then they'll match with a different cousin, and we're all related, but we didn't all get the same DNA. So that's why we really need to learn how to use this, because it's confusing when we get that far back, isn't it?
It is confusing. As you are looking at your cousin matches and seeing what you share with the different cousins and trying to trace back to the common ancestor or the most recent common ancestor, because sometimes you have pedigree collapse or a situation where it's a small area and people married from different families married within that group and had offspring. So, yeah, there are different aspects of it, but the exciting thing is that you may connect with a cousin who has done a lot more genealogical research or inherited a lot of, like, the family Bible, or inherited great records that will help you to move beyond your brick wall. So, we really want to connect with those cousins and talk to them. And, maybe somebody has the original documents that they brought from the old country, and you don't really know where they came from, but this other cousin does. So that is part of the power of having a lot of DNA matches and connecting with them, because they may have more information that you do about your shared ancestor.
Oh, that's a great point. We sometimes think, especially when we've researched a family a lot, that we know everything there is to know about them. Then we quickly find out when we connect to these cousins that, oh no, we didn't know everything. They got a whole different story passed down and different records passed down. So great point that it is a perfect way for us to just explore our ancestry, our brick walls, and learn so much more.
Well, I think it's time to start talking about Y-DNA, right?
Yes, the Y chromosome has been well tested. It's from chromosome, and it is passed virtually intact from father to son to grandson and so on. And it goes back hundreds or thousands of years. And over time, there are mutations that occur. And that is what you see when you have distance from someone that you share most of the Y chromosome with. It's, a match, but it means that it'll show you the likelihood of a mutation happening within a certain number of generations. So the only companies that test Y-DNA directly it's family tree DNA. And if you're a woman, you don't have a Y chromosome. So if you have a brother or a cousin that could test to verify that family line, take advantage of that. The recommendation is to test as many markers as you can afford. And the marker is a location on the Y chromosome that they are looking at. And they're looking for the STRs, or the short tandem repeats, which are repeated sequences of nucleotides. And sometimes people get, let's say, 7, and then another person will have 10, and another person will have 12. That's how they put all the 7s in one category and the 12s in a different category. And that's how they kind of divide those people up.
Yes, when I tested my father-in-law's Y-DNA, we started at 30 something markers, and then we had so many matches that we wanted to go to a higher resolution, so we went up to 67. And then recently we upgraded to 111 markers. So it's nice to know at Family Tree DNA that you can start with just a small amount and see what you get, and then you can upgrade later. And you don't have to send in a new sample because they keep your sample for you for a while. So it's nice to know that you can just start with something basic and see if your questions are answered from that. And then if not, if you have too many matches and you need to narrow them down, you can upgrade to another higher level. So what you were saying about the short tandem repeats, that took me kind of a while to really figure out and understand, but I really think it's cool to look at the surname projects because it shows you all of the results for each person who's submitted it in a huge table or spreadsheet. And then you can see like how they match up, and they kind of get sorted into groups, and you can see who shares the same number of repeats at certain locations. So for me, that was a really helpful way to really dive in and understand the Y-DNA results. So we've talked about now autosomal DNA and Y-DNA, and now we have mitochondrial DNA.
So mitochondrial DNA is found in the mitochondria that are in each of your cells. And the mitochondria is an organelle, or a small biological piece that's in each one of your cells. And they are powerhouses of the cell. They transform nutrients into energy. And you have many mitochondria in your cells. And that mitochondrial DNA looks like a circle. And the mitochondria is passed from the mothers to their children. So men do have mitochondrial DNA that came from their mothers, but they don't pass it on to their children. So Diana, if your father was deceased, then it's a great idea to go to a cousin descended from one of his sisters, your cousin that's descended from one of his sisters, because she carries the DNA that goes back on your father's mother's line.
Right. So I'm looking at my pedigree chart here. And so I would go to my grandmother, and then I would just go straight back on the female line, right? And my matches are somewhere along that line. Is that correct? Am I thinking correctly?
You are thinking correctly. And the thing about mitochondrial DNA does not mutate as often as the 22 autosomes that we've got. And so these origins of this maternal mitochondrial DNA go back thousands of years. So it's not the most effective use of your money if you have a limited amount and you're using DNA to find ancestors. But it is fascinating, and it can help to identify whether women or descendants of different women came from the same grandmother way back.
So I have a lot of clients who have proposed or hypothesized Native American ancestry or African American ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
Would mitochondrial DNA show something like that, or is that better shown through autosomal?
It definitely can show that. The issue is it only goes up that mother's line. And, when we go back several generations, we have thousands of ancestors that contributed to our DNA. So this one just goes back on that one line. Maybe a person may have African or Native American DNA.
Wow, so fascinating. I know when I look at my matches, I have no idea who any of my matches are, but then I look at my chart and I have a huge brick wall, which is probably why, because I haven't identified anything past, I think, my fifth, maybe it's my fourth great grandmother on that line. So can I use that to break down that brick wall eventually?
Sure, if you can find a descendant of any of the women that were born from that particular great grandmother, if you can find a descendant today, you can verify that that is the correct great grandmother. Then if you can find some other people, they may tie into, and they know farther back on the line, you can tie your mitochondrial DNA back a few more generations.
Okay, interesting. Well, I'll have to have that be the focus of one of my projects so that I can really dive in and work on that and see what I can do. Because now I have you to help me do that. I can figure out what to do. I'm excited about that.
I am too. So, some other interesting things about mitochondrial DNA is that's the kind of DNA that you hear about in the news that helps to establish the identity of soldiers who were lost and then were recovered in battle, or lost in battle, and then their remains were left in the battlefield. And some of those people, their remains have been located, and then they do DNA tests on the mitochondrial DNA, and then they find living family members who they can compare that DNA to, and it helps to identify that fallen soldier.
I have a friend who works on that repatriation project at Brigham Young University, and I think that is such a neat service and an amazing way to use DNA. I think also they're starting to use autosomal DNA. Is that correct? I know they started with mitochondrial, but I'm wondering if they're also using autosomal.
That's a great question. I'm not sure about that either. I need to look more into it.
That's neat that they can use the mitochondrial DNA after so long. It sounds like it's preserved in teeth and bones. Is that what?
That's right. When I was at BYU, we did some research on Egyptian mummies, and they actually drilled into the teeth of the mummies to get the mitochondrial DNA out of there. The challenges with remains is contamination from dirt, from bacteria, from the elements. And so you've got to find a location or something in the body that's been preserved long enough that you can get some of that very fragile DNA out.
Wow, so many things to learn. And I think that we're kind of the tip of the iceberg with how we use all of this DNA stuff with all these different tests. So thanks for sharing so much with that. We've talked about autosomal, Y-DNA, and mitochondrial. So we've basically covered all the different types of testing. So now we just, we're kind of need to wrap up this episode, but I think we need to cover this whole idea of informed consent. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that.
If you are asking someone to take a DNA test, someone whose DNA will help you in your genealogical research, you really need to help them understand the long-term implications of genetic testing. There's always a possibility that you may discover previously unknown relatives. So someone that was placed for adoption, or you may learn that some family connections are not biological. They're not with the parent who you expect to have. I've worked with a lot of people who are adopted and helped them to find their biological family members. And in my experience so far, the reunions have been positive and a lot of healing has taken place. On the other hand, it can be a very emotional journey. It can be a roller coaster ride as a person adjusts to that new information. And so the tester really needs to know about those possibilities before agreeing to take a DNA test. And if you are the one who is overseeing those test results, they need to sign an informed consent agreement. So this needs to be something that can be done by email, or it could be a paper that you have. Basically, they're saying, yes, I understand that I may come across some unknown information and this is okay with me. I have another example of I have a good friend here, and after hearing some of my stories, different family members gave them DNA tests for Christmas, and they were curious about their ethnicity, but they opted out of the DNA matching because they don't want to know about any unknown surprises that they may have. And that's fine because that is their prerogative. That is their DNA. It's themselves that they are making decisions for. The problem is if you are making decisions for other people and they don't know about it, like for example, if you wanted to use their DNA and move it over to GEDmatch and they don't know about it, then you've got some ethical problems. And it's important. We want to be honest and ethical and transparent because the most good will come out of situations where people know exactly what's going on.
Right. And I know at our advanced class at SLIG on DNA, we had an entire afternoon where we talked about the ethics of DNA testing. And one of the suggestions was when you ask someone to test that you do this informed consent agreement, and then you ask them, do you want to know if something surprising comes up? Let them make the decision right then that yes, I do want to know, or no, I don't want to know. Because several of the people in our group had this exact situation come up and they didn't know what to do. Should they tell their uncle that he's not related to the family? But if you at the very beginning say, do you want to know or not? Then you don't have to make the choice. They've already made the choice about if they want to know or not. So just something else to keep in mind.
I think it's really tricky to decide in advance, but it's good to at least give people that option. And when people are signing up to take the DNA test themselves, they do have to click that they agree to the terms of service. But I really like the idea of just discussing it with them because often people will skip over and not really read everything that they're agreeing to when they buy the kit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's really important to just have that discussion so it's all out in the open. One discussion that I had with a relative, I asked if he would mind if I moved his results over to GEDmatch. And he said, I don't want to do that. I'd rather not know different things and I'd rather that it be kept more private. And so we said, fine, that's great. Let's honor what you want. And I've had a clear conscience over that because I've honored his wishes. One point that we didn't bring up that I think is really important in this episode is wondering your testing strategy, who should you test? And you should test the oldest living people in your family first because they have more DNA shared with that ancestor that you are the elusive ancestor behind the brick wall that you are seeking. In my own family, having tested my great uncle, that was the key to unlocking some really important information. And I was so thankful that we had asked someone who was 2 generations above me to test.
Yeah, that's a great point because I think we sometimes get excited to test ourselves or our children and we forget that we're going to get more DNA from that older generation. So that's a good place to put our money if we're just barely getting started and we really want to use this for genealogy's purpose. So, Robin, where can we learn more?
There are a lot of great resources out there. One place is the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, Wiki. that is at isog.org or isogg.org. They have a lot of great information. Blaine Bettinger has a website called DNACentral.com, and he's got some fantastic webinars and information where you can learn. There are great videos on YouTube. More people are learning more about it and are willing to teach.
Right. One of my favorite ways to learn, and I said this earlier, is I like to try it out as I'm watching a webinar. So I have two screens on my desk here, and so I will pull up a webinar from YouTube or from Blaine Bettinger's site, DNA Central, and this is how I learned how to use DNA Painter that you referenced. He was giving the demonstration, and then on my other screen, I actually was doing it. And oh my goodness, that makes such a difference to be watching and then to be trying it out, because some of these things are difficult to wrap your mind around how to use it. And so I highly recommend trying that approach. And or maybe you could be playing a podcast and then trying it on your screen. Anytime where you can pause and figure or work through something, it can really help you to wrap your mind around some of the information and tools. Well, it's time to wrap up our episode here. We're so excited to have Robin with us. And as you could tell from this episode, she is so great at explaining DNA. So thank you so much, Robin, for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us. It's been so fun to have you here today.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I feel like this potential of DNA research coupled with good genealogy work is one of the most exciting things in recent years to help break through many brick walls. I think in years to come, more and more people will take DNA tests, which will help all of us to make more family connections, and more tools and techniques will be available for use. And I think the greatest thing about all of this is that it can bring about understanding and healing in families. As you learn more about your ancestors, you can learn about why they did some of the things they did, and it can bring about a lot of peace and joy to your own self, as well as enriching the lives of your family members.
That's so wonderful. I love that. It's so hopeful to think that we can make all these new connections coming in the future. Thank you, Robin. All right, that wraps up our episode for today, and we will be talking about DNA again soon. So make sure you stay tuned for future episodes with Robin. All right, have a great week.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.